You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're at the 2023 Mpact Conference closing plenary in Phoenix, Arizona. Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy at USDOT Christopher Coes leads a panel discussing what's happening in central cities and how to make them thrive again. Stay with us. Today's podcast was produced in partnership with Mpact, formerly Railvolution. For a deeper dive on livability issues, visit mpactmobility.org, mpactmobility.org. Today's podcast is brought to you by our wonderful, amazing Patreon supporters. Your support is critical to Talking Headways and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. We really appreciate it. To join this gang of zoning misfits and transportation rabble-rousers, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. Thanks so much to everybody who supports the show, from the bus drivers to the advocates all around the world. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. And for more information on our work and where to find our daily newsletter, the transportation scarves, our Cars Are Cholesterol merch, buy books from the authors that join us on the show at our bookshop affiliate site, or find our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's Town Planning and Practice, check out the show notes on your podcatcher or visit theoverheadwire.com. And finally, if you're in the Bay Area, we're going to do a live podcast recording on Thursday, December 14th, hosted by the Bay Area Regional Collaborative with John King of the SF Chronicle, discussing his new book entitled Portal, San Francisco's Ferry Building and the Reinvention of American Cities. You can RSVP by going to tinyurl.com/portaltalk. Really looking forward to it and seeing a lot of you there. That's tinyurl.com/portaltalk.
It's really great to be here with all of you. I want to take a moment of personal privilege before I bring up this amazing panel that we're going to have today, discussion we're going to have today, and really just say thank you. Thank you to Mpact, formerly known as Revolution. Thank you to Congressman Earl Blumenauer, Jackie Crenshaw, if you're still here, and so many of you, because in the years, for folks who don't know, I was just about a year and 3 years ago, actually now. I can't remember how long I've been in this administration. 3 years ago, sitting in the same seats that you have been in. And it is here in rooms like this where we all together debated, we learned from each other, we innovated, and we connected around what it really means to create livable communities for everyone. And in this space, in this room, I remember all the times that we kept saying, TOD is great, it's amazing. But some of you joined, organizations like Smart Growth America, Reconnecting America, on Capitol Hill, where we would actually hear that things like livable communities, or TOD, was kind of perceived as a four-letter word. Remember those days, right? Now fast track nearly 15, 20 years, how the world has changed, right? And how the fact that across the country, whether in rural communities or even our urban major cities, we're looking at livable communities as the framework of how we are going to move this country forward. And that, to me, is really exciting. But of course, what is also exciting for me in this moment, now as I look around the space and see how full it is, so thank you for staying for the lunch and hearing the panel. But more importantly, if you just take your memory back to 2020, we couldn't have done this. If we all remember, we couldn't have actually predicted, the impacts of COVID-19 on not just our communities, but our own individual lives. And I think if you all remember in those early days, we were hearing from our public health officials that we had to not allow our staff, our friends, our colleagues to actually go into work. In many cases, places like San Francisco, Seattle, New York even started mandating that people work from home to protect ourselves. Those decisions, this pandemic, in addition to things that we were seeing already in terms of the racial disparities in our communities, the climate crisis that was involving, we were under siege. And unfortunately, in too many places across the country, the result of not only this pandemic and the challenges that we were seeing in the economy, we saw so many businesses, coffee shops in our city centers that relied on that 9-to-5 commuter workforce close. And they found it difficult to pay their employees and keep their doors open. We also saw that impact of COVID, the economic challenges on our transit systems across the country. These systems that relied on fare box recovery to fund operations, well, even still today, we're seeing many of those transit agencies still struggle to recruit that ridership. But these were challenges. But I have to say, In those 10 to 15 years, I got to sit in this space with all of you in those sessions where we learned, debated, connected. When I came into the Biden administration on day one, on January 20th, 2021, I took all those lessons, all those workshops, and your friendship and your words of wisdom with me on day one. And I can say with a level of certainty, the discussions and the leadership and the best practices that were discussed in this space were actually at the center of the Biden administration Build Back Better plan. And that is why I can tell you that this administration saw an opportunity, not only to how we can get out of the pandemic, but how do we do it in a way that makes sure every community feels and breathes the ethos that's sitting in this room today, that we believe everyone should be able to live in a community that is thriving. And that is why at the Department of Transportation, we've been embracing the President's call, Secretary Pete's leadership around the bipartisan infrastructure law that really emphasized this idea of bottom-up, middle-out approach. And I have to say, I remember in this room someone used to say, we needed more money for transit, right? You remember those days? Well, guess what? Through the bipartisan infrastructure law, we have the largest investment in public transportation ever in the history of this country. I remember someone talking in this room how important that is us to create a national system that allows people to get around, particularly through passenger rail. Well, guess what? We got that done. We had the largest investment in passenger rail ever in the history since the creation of Amtrak. Folks said, you know what? If we're going to make our cities livable, we had to prioritize people, not just cars. And turns out, even during COVID, we saw over 42,000 individuals die on our roadways, in our cities. And disproportionately, it was happening in communities of color as well as rural places. Well, you know what? Because of you, because of your advice, because of your leadership, we actually now have more funding dedicated to addressing the roadway fatalities through our Safe Streets for All program, and for the first time, making complete streets a federal policy. You guys did that. You should give yourselves a round of applause for that. But of course, we talk all the time about how transportation can shape lives, the air we breathe, how we get around our communities. But we also know that sometimes infrastructure can be the thing that's been used in the past as a way to divide our communities. Those are conversations we have been having. I actually just attended a session yesterday about highway capping. It's because of those discussions. We now have over $3 billion through our Reconnected Communities and Neighborhood Access and Equity Program to do something about that, where we can now connect more communities to neighborhoods with good jobs, with good health care, and greater access. You guys did that, and you should be thankful for that. Now, I'm going to close. A lot of talk has been around this administration around the funding pieces. And as an Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy, trust me, I see all the applications that you're submitting. And so please don't ask me. But it's not just about the money. It's also about the policy. It's also recognizing that it's not about the highway system in of itself. It's also how do we build our communities. And I can sit here and say with a level of certainty that we as the Department of Transportation are not just committed in making sure that we're spending the money wisely in a way that's coordinated with housing and transportation, but we're making sure that our own staff are better suited to do that as well. We're institutionalizing in the department, but we're also working very closely with state DOTs and MPOs. Because of your work and your voices, we were actually able, through the bipartisan infrastructure law, now require housing to be part of the overall transportation planning process, which will allow us to get more livable communities happening across the country. Now, with that being said, with these resources and these new rules that we're going to produce, we recognize that we can't do it alone. And that's why I'm just so excited for colleagues like Maria Zimmerman and Sharice Taylor and so many folks from the Build America Bureau, because we were putting so much money, over $30 million just in the last several months, to support our Thriving Communities work, to help support more livable communities, more complete neighborhoods, more TOD projects, and even hopefully create more rural main streets that are linked up with our passenger rail system that we're planning to build out. But again, this cannot be done by the federal government alone. And there are still challenges that we have. And that is why I'm just so excited to have this panel today. Because finally, with historic investments through the bipartisan infrastructure law, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as the American Rescue Plan. We have an opportunity where the federal government can be a new partner, not just with ourselves at headquarters, but actually with cities and community organizations on the ground. And so today, I'm thrilled to introduce our panel. And so I'm going to call them up individually, give them a quick bio, so they come up one by one, and then we're going to have a conversation. So first, let me invite Dr. Karen Chapple. Karen is actually currently the director of School of Cities at the University of Toronto. She also leads the Downtown Recovery Research Project, which is a collaboration between the School of Cities and the Institute of Governmental Studies at UC Berkeley. Let's give her a round of applause as she comes up. Next, I would like to introduce a dear friend, Emeke Moneme, who's, as you all know, a major strategic advisor and executive leader, not only on urban mobility and finance, but currently serves as executive director for the Chapple Riverfront in Washington, D.C., which I can say DOT is a current resident within that district. Next, we have Nichol Bordeaux. Yes, give him a round of applause as well. Next up, we have Nichol Bordeaux, who's currently the Chief Planning and Engagement Officer at the Utah Transit Authority. She brings over 20 years of experience in communications and government relations. Please come on up, Nichol. Next, we have Brewer. He's currently the executive director at the Salt Lake City Downtown Alliance, which is currently managing a number of things, great things actually, including the Downtown Farmers Market, which employs construction mitigation services across the district, as well as creating a great, safe, clean, and courteous experience for all the downtown residents. Let's give him a round of applause as well. Last but not least, we're going to have Ryan Johnson join. Ryan Johnson is currently the CEO and co-founder of the Culdesac Incorporated, which builds and manages walkable neighborhoods. I'll have to say, as someone who used to manage the national network of walkable real estate developers, Ryan, you speak to my heart. So let's welcome Ryan as well. Guys, have a seat. So there's two things we're going to do here. So before we engage with the panel with a series of questions and conversations, I'm going to invite Dr. Chapple to actually give us a 10-minute presentation on some of the research she's been doing around the intersectionality of downtowns and transit and what she is seeing in terms of the marketplace. And then that will frame the conversation moving forward. Karen?
Terrific. Thanks so much. Great to be back at Mpact. Great to be talking about downtowns and how they are actually coming back. And transit is too. So this is research that I've done with my wonderful students in planning and engineering at Berkeley, plus a team at University of Toronto. Shout out to the Berkeley peeps who have really fueled the rail evolution in this country over the last 30 years. So, downtowns fall and come back, time after time, after disasters. And part of it is because transit is the backbone of cities, and transit is what makes that density possible, density of residents, density of jobs, density of visitors. Highways nearly destroyed cities. The cities that are doing best and coming back are the ones that have already taken down their highways. Europe, there's a whole other story, but Europe actually spared its cities by putting the highways around instead of through them. So downtown, beginning of the pandemic, we saw it empty out, and people started proclaiming the death of downtown. We said, well, we don't think this is actually true, and we think we can use cell phone trajectories to prove it. So we used SafeGraph and then Spectus data. 18 million cell phones across North America, tracked cell phone activity, really looking at what was happening in the downtown areas. This is what it looks like. This is the type of data we get, for instance, in Toronto. And this is the sort of impact you can see in the city using this type of data, very powerful data. So this is Toronto, the downtown's in red. This is before the pandemic. This is when the pandemic hits, boom, the red goes way down. And then after the pandemic is easing up, you see that comeback. And what's interesting here, lots of activity downtown, right, before the pandemic. Pandemic hits, and then post-pandemic, you start to see downtown coming back a little bit, but the areas all around in the neighborhoods, the more suburban areas, the suburban job centers, coming back maybe even a little bit faster than downtown. And this pattern we're still dealing with today. So this is how we define downtowns based on job densities. We use what we call a recovery rate, which actually compares activity today to activity in the same season before the pandemic. You can go to our website, downtownrecovery.com. I bought this for $3. at the outset of the pandemic. Nobody else cared about downtown. It's now worth $2,000. So invest in domains is really good. So this is our rankings. They've been covered in many, many different venues. But overall, we're finding that the downtowns are back at about 74% on median. And it varies a lot across different regions, with the southwest of the U.S. really doing the best, and then some of the Pacific Coast and northeastern cities and Midwestern cities struggling. The Midwestern here are in the light blue, and right now in our rankings, they're at the very lowest. Europe did very, very differently. So we compared this to downtowns in Europe, which are defined more by history and by culture than by office districts. And guess what? They came back at a much, much faster rate than any North American downtown. So it's a lesson for us for thinking about, what do we want our downtowns to be now that the office district is probably obsolete? Maybe we need to think about cultural and historical uses downtown. Now, by the way, we can look building by building, block by block, and this is really helpful as we work with cities to figure out how they want to come back. So we ran a model to figure out what matters. What is driving the comeback of some cities, and why are some coming back so much faster than others? So we looked at a variety of variables, and I'll share some of the correlations with you and then the overall model results. So biggest negative correlation, professional jobs. So those downtowns that really were over-concentrated in professional jobs, like management, consulting, lawyers, accountants, the folks that don't need to be together to be productive, they're not doing so well. Many of these actually were in the Class B and C space that is really, really suffering in downtowns. So negative correlation with professional jobs, negative correlation also with financial and insurance jobs, positive correlation if you happen to have a lot of hotels and food services downtown. This is, I think, why the southwestern downtowns, Phoenix, some other places have really thrived. Salt Lake City and others have done really well. Population density, sadly, is negatively correlated with downtown recovery. So people right now are avoiding density. They're avoiding population density and they're avoiding employment density. I think, using our long view as urbanists, I think this is a temporary trend. I don't think this will last, but we'll see. Commuting by car. Now, please don't push me off the stage. But the cities that are recovering fastest are relying on car commuters. So again, let's just hope by next year this correlation's gone. I'll come back and show it, and maybe we'll have a better picture. But at the beginning of the pandemic, people just didn't want to be around people. They wanted to be in their cars, and this has really affected how quickly downtowns come back. Commute times, this is a major, major factor. The longer the commute time, the less likely your downtown is to recover. So people just don't like those long commutes anymore. And I think this one is here to stay. I don't think we're going to see people doing the mega commutes anymore. So we ran a random forest regression model on this to figure out what mattered most. And just to zoom in here a little bit, you can see the top ones here have to do with the economy, and transit, particularly long commutes, even more than just reliance on transit. It's those mega commutes that are problematic. Okay, so we're just starting to look at transit, and I just want to give a shout out to Tracy Haddon-Lowe at Brookings Institution, who already has a terrific paper on this and made many, many great points, and I just stole 2 of them, but I wanted to steal 10 of them. One of her great points is that, we have off-peak ridership that is recovering much quicker than peak hour ridership, and then second point is about bus services, and that we see much quicker recovery in bus service than we're seeing in rail lines, and I would argue that has to do with essential workers, and she makes some of that case in her work as well. So we looked at this. We looked at the correlation between downtown recovery and transit recovery, and found that they are positively correlated. So they go hand in hand. You want to have both. Cities that are downtowns are coming back. They're also seeing a resurgence in their transit system. This differs across type of transit, though. So positive correlation with bus ridership, negative correlation with light rail. So light rail is not that tightly connected to the fate of downtown. It's connected to the fate of other things, but not as closely connected as bus ridership or as metro subway ridership or as commuter rail naturally has the highest correlation with downtown recovery. One last study I want to mention, we've just started doing a study of transit-oriented neighborhoods and comparing them to those without transit. So in here, this is Toronto. This is the red neighborhoods have access to a subway stop. The green are the controls that don't. We do a little model, see which one's doing better. So it turns out that recovery rates are higher in TOD neighborhoods. So TOD neighborhoods are more resilient than the ones without it, controlling for a whole mess of factors. So we'll be publishing that one soon. So policy implications, make sure we diversify our downtown economies, our land uses. We've got to think more about residential, but we've also got to think more about cultural uses, arts, and repopulating our space with pop-ups and startups. Make it easier to convert buildings, make sure that downtowns are, of course, affordable. I advocate lots of new student housing downtown as a way of getting a lot of activity there, but also, more affordable housing downtown, since we're losing that proximity to opportunities often in our cities. This is a great place to put affordability. And then finally, investing strategically in transit and walkability. I think we need to double down on transit. It is coming back, but we can do even better. Downtown is for people. Who could say it better than Jane Jacobs? She wrote that in 1957, guys. That was, 66 years ago or something? And we still haven't figured it out. We got to make sure our downtowns are for people. So that's our website, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen, for that. So we're going to have a conversation because you gave us a lot of really important information, some of which may be counterintuitive in many cases, where in a lot of communities we're seeing transit-supported communities actually not only have maintained value, but actually in many cases have exceeded, particularly when it comes to housing costs. So one of the first questions, and I kind of taking this back to my remarks of where we were in the COVID and how cities responded. Dee, I want to turn to you because, Salt Lake City for many cases has been like a poster child of what livable community is supposed to look like, and particularly in the downtown. Can you just talk about how you and the Alliance are trying to dig out of the COVID, and where do you see, the challenge as it relates to Karen's presentation?
Thank you, and thank you to the other panelists too. I'm glad to participate in this conversation. I have to acknowledge, first off, it really helps to have the tailwinds of a strong and diverse economy, which we do in the state of Utah, and that smooths out a lot of the bumps. Given that, what we are seeing is an evolution in our downtown economy. It tracks with the data we just saw, and arts and entertainment is a big part of that. Our tracking on office, I believe the data shows us at about 82% on total visitation. That tracks with what we see. Office is probably down around 70%, 68% in our market. But our nighttime economy is back, and it's back in force. And that's what we're really leveraging. And let me, if I could, talk about some data that we looked at. We looked at our top visitation days for last year. What really drove that, and what could we correlate with those top days? 78% of those days had events at the Delta Center. That's where the Utah Jazz play. That's where Bieber and Disney on Ice and monster truck shows and everything else comes. 72% of those top visitation days, we had a major convention in town, again in the convention district, and that hospitality component is really material to the success that we're seeing. Over half of those top visitation days had 8 or more arts and culture events in downtown on that night, on that day. So symphony, opera, ballet, Broadway theater, etc. And then shopping has been sort of a slow drip system, if you will, with some spikes around the holidays, and February 13th is another big shopping day.
From the private sector perspective, Ryan, you're building literally car-free communities, right? What are you seeing in terms of the data? Why are you putting more time and investment in creating these communities?
Yeah, so we started Culdesac 5 years ago. I was at Open Door before that, and I think Open Door has the best data in real estate. And what I saw so clearly, both in the data and hearing from so many customers, was that people want to live in walkable neighborhoods. And there's this recent NAR study that says every generation would pay a premium to live in a walkable neighborhood, including 92% of Gen Z. And the challenge is that we largely stopped building them with the advent of cars. But there's been a lot of innovation in transportation, and that lets us build walkable neighborhoods again. And so we have something called Culdesac Tempe with 1,000 residents. It's open today. I live there. It's a thriving community, and I know some people came to the tours there and would love to show you more there. But the reason why it's possible is that our residents, instead of a private vehicle, they use a portfolio of transportation options. And we're right on the light rail. My uncle actually worked for Valley Metro, and he's retired now, but I showed him Culdesac one day, and he said, "This is why we built this."
Oh, that's great, Ryan. And, you know, we keep having this conversation, and Cameron, you talked about transit and how communities in your research that actually embrace transit were coming out of the recovery quicker. And so I would love for Nichol, if you could talk about, you know, we just heard from D how he's seeing the market, but what is your transit agency doing to recover?
Well, thank you, and thank you all to the panelists. And I kind of geek out on this. It's really exciting for us to talk about Salt Lake City and UTA. So during the pandemic, we really looked at, as every transit agency did, where we could reduce service because people weren't using it. It was kind of a clean slate for us, which really allowed UTA to look at how we recover, right? So it wasn't based on the old economy or how people were traveling back and forth. We really started to look at, number one, our bus network. We saw people during the pandemic and continue. It was rising. Our numbers are above pandemic numbers on some of our rides because of the essential workers. And we also started to see transit ridership flatten out. So it wasn't these big spikes on commuter. It was big spikes on events, downtown, entertainment, Garth Brooks. And I know if anybody's had to do Garth Brooks, you're going to have a little,
Swift.
yeah, or Taylor Swift, you know, you have a little post-traumatic stress syndrome transit agency. But we saw those big recoveries. And what's exciting for us is concentrating on how to build that going forward. But now we understand it's really going to be about arts, culture, entertainment, and it isn't a 8 to 5 economy anymore. We really have to look at late nights, which we work with our partner in Salt Lake City to do more, and Saturdays, which every mode is up on Saturdays, and buses up almost 18% on Sundays. So it's those weekend travelers, it's the entertainment that we're seeing.
Let me just follow up. For those transit agencies who are here, what advice would you give them to be more adaptable to this change?
Well, I think it's important to look at when people are riding and looking for other opportunities to get that ridership. So during the day, making partnerships with events, which we do as Ticket is Fair, making sure people can get down and get into the system when they want to. But also, I know we're here and it used to be rail, but really looking at your connections to your bus system and how that can help you and be flexible and work with you where your ridership and connectivity, and especially downtown where trips are small, they're not long, and people want to get where they can go, walk, but then if there's a little bit longer, they can hop on a bus or your train. So I would look at that system about really looking at the walkability of your community and how you can access that.
Thank you. Emeke, we've heard a lot now from the panelists, but also from the research that entertainment is a huge driver, right, for bringing people back to the core. And at the Chapple Riverfront, for those who don't know, as aware, we have the Nats Stadium, the Washington Nats, go Braves. We also, but we also have a number of entertainment, but also you have a lot of office tenants, including Department of Transportation. So can you just talk about the role of like maybe your anchor institutions of holding the community together and bringing the downtown back?
Hello. First of all, thank you for allowing me to be on the panel. Really pleased to be on the stage with folks. And thank you for the quick commercial for the Capitol Riverfront bid. We are a 500-acre neighborhood on the banks of the Anacostia River, 5 blocks from the U.S. Capitol complex. And we do host, in addition to the USDOT, the Nationals, Washington Nationals, DC United. And we're able to use those assets that the city thought really strategically about 15 years ago to place them there in a neighborhood that didn't really exist. 15 years ago, less than 1,000 people lived in the neighborhood. Today, we're home to 20,000 residents that live there. We have a Metro Rail stop that was built at the same time that we built the baseball stadium, again, thinking ahead about what do we want the mix of transportation options to be in this community. And then we've really invested a lot of money in making sure that we've taken advantage of our riverfront location to build pedestrian trails, access to the water, amenities to bring people down there, not just on the 100 to 120 days a year where there is some sort of a game or an event going on in our neighborhood, but to come down for the quality of life. I thought the slide that really grabbed my attention was the comparison of the European cities to US cities. And just that distinction between quality of life as being the driver for community recovery. Those cities have something special, unique, that draws people there, regardless if they're going to go check in at the office to go to work. They're coming down there to enjoy the city, to experience the city. And that's really what we try to cultivate in the neighborhood, is that experience.
Let me follow up with that, because again, I'm hearing entertainment, quality of life, being the driver, being a livable community, right? What I did not hear is more office space.
Yeah, so we've got 58% of the land use in the neighborhood is residential. Only about 28% is office. And I think there's been an intentionality to kind of get that balance right. I'm sure many of my development property owners want more office in the neighborhood. They always want more office. But I think we're now rethinking what that right mix is. I think in downtown DC, 90% of the land use is office. And it's the one that's still trying to figure out how it moves forward through this position. I think we've kind of got the balance right at 60, maybe a little bit more office, but it's a different type of office. And we were just talking earlier about with WeWork filing for bankruptcy, I think the entire market's kind of thinking about, well, what's the right format, location, and quantity of office you need to kind of make that 15-minute neighborhood piece work. You have to have some presence there, but getting the balance right is what we've been focused on.
Ryan, do you want to touch on that? What are you seeing in terms of the market? Like, what are the challenges of the fact that we have so much office space now in downtowns that need to get converted? What do you see the opportunity or the barrier for addressing that?
So what we're seeing is there's a lot of remote workers that creates geographic flexibility. We also have co-working on site that helps people that are working remote, and also smaller scale entrepreneurship. And we're also seeing a flight to quality. I think the challenges are bigger in B and C office space, and that's one of the reasons why Tempe is doing disproportionately well. It has the highest price office space along Tempe Town Lake, and so those will always be filled eventually. I think it's the things that are farther out in the burbs where people don't really want to be there as much as they do in a walkable, thriving area.
So let's take a step back. Karen, you talked about some policy ideas. I love policy. From your perspective, what is the main policy issue that the federal government should be focusing on today?
Well, I do like that the federal government is looking at office conversion and has an RFP out on research on that. I think we kind of have to look carefully at the tax structures. And right now, a lot of our cities are all set up to give big tax abatements to commercial office development. And so, we need to probably rethink our tax structure. I mean, I always go back to 1986 and Reagan and the multifamily apartments and how we lost that type. I mean, that's the sort of structural reform we kind of need in order to get land uses kind of mixed up downtown. Also, cities have been really slow to act. And this has been striking and depressing for me, that cities have been waiting kind of for the commercial landlords to figure out what's going on and what they want to do. And the thing is that those landlords are sitting on space because it's easier for them to keep it empty and wait it out, right? And that's a disaster from a public good and a public, space and civic infrastructure perspective. We can't have that. We can't afford that. And so we need to force those commercial landlords to take some action. I don't know exactly what that is, but maybe you can ask some of your buddies.
Emeke, I imagine that if you had a policy magic wand, you may have an approach. What would it be?
Well, I want to double down on the tax structure piece. An interesting piece of data for us. So 2019, before the pandemic, property taxes were the main driver for value in our communities. Mm-hmm. Property tax, sales tax, and income tax. What we saw over the 5 to 6 years transition through COVID is that income tax was the chief generator of tax benefit out of our neighborhood adjacent to us, and the other business improvement district, NOMA, north of Massachusetts Avenue. They're growing. It's the people moving in, high earners, spending money, sales tax remained to number 2, property tax dropped to number 3. So I think this data is telling us that structurally our economy is successful growing economies are more dependent upon, again, that quality of life that drives people to choose to live there, maybe even work in the neighborhood as some co-working space, spend their money, go out to eat in that neighborhood. That's what's generating that flywheel for the economy for downtown. As it relates to policy, where do we begin? I'll share a vignette. So 23 years ago, when I first moved to DC as a bright, eager, less gray-haired young man, I came to do real estate development. I thought that's why I'm in DC. I want to go build things. I worked for then Mayor Williams in DC, and I ended up doing an internship where they put me in the transportation department. I spent a month complaining, why would you send me to the transportation department when I came here to do real estate development? And then within 6 months, I completely understood that I was doing real estate and economic development by working in transportation. So I think anything that we can do to further tie that link between land use decision-making, transportation investment decision-making closer and closer together, including EV investment, right? Because that's a piece of the action. Those are the big levers. That's the piece that's going to move private capital to take action once it sees the federal government move.
So pivoting, obviously, federal government doesn't have all the answers. A lot of the solutions we're finding are happening at the state and local level. And, what better to have this conversation, what's happening in Salt Lake City. So Dee, we would love to hear how you guys are navigating this challenge that a lot of these downtowns are facing right now.
Well, a couple of things happening. Our residential population is growing. We feel good about that, actually doubling in the next 24 to 30 months, just with the occupancy of what is currently under construction. Now, we have a small downtown residential population, about 5,000, but we're going to crest 10,000 when we fill up what is under construction right now. When I think about the office situation, what do? We program, right? We try to make downtown an amenity that is attractive. And a lot of my real estate friends talk about, we're not in the real estate business, we're in the human capital business. We are attracting human capital, and I see what we do as an instrument of that. So, like many cities, we produced open streets programming during the pandemic, and even as late as just a couple of weeks ago, where we closed our main street to traffic, to automobiles, made it a pedestrian corridor, programmed entertainment every night. Again, it's about driving traffic downtown on those specific nights, but it's also about creating a destination for the region. It's about creating habits for coming downtown for those arts, culture, and entertainment amenities.
So we're going to pivot just a little bit, because one of the conversations that we are having at the federal level is not only how do we build back better, and we have clearly this Invest in America agenda that does that, but we're also recognizing that we are in the middle of a climate crisis. And one of the things that I always loved about coming to this convening is the fact that the solutions are in this room, right? And one of the things that I have, and Emeke, with the Navy Yard, I see all the scooters, I see all the different micromobility, but the fact that I have a private sector developer here who is literally designing car-free neighborhoods, I'm curious from your perspective, what is the mode of transportation for the future besides walking?
It's a full portfolio. And the most popular of the options for our residents is the Valley Metro light rail. But there's also, thank you.
That was a softball if you haven't noticed.
Yeah. Electric bikes, which really hockey sticked. And the number one electric bike company is here in Phoenix, started by somebody who's only 27 now. It's called Electric. Every resident of Culdesac gets a free electric bike. We're leasing if anybody's interested. Got to plug that. And then electric scooters. And also rideshare. We're partnering with Lyft. Our residents get 15% off. And then AV ride hail, including Waymo, has really come out of nowhere. And that might be a four-letter word in this audience, but it paired with the other transportation modes is going to really make a big difference. And it's popular with our residents now. And I think in particular, the combination of the AV ride hail and bikes, when you're on a bike and you see a Waymo that actually respects even a painted bike lane, that's when it starts to click. And you say that, even though having more cars is not the outcome in and of itself, having road safety enables a lot of things. And when we don't need parking spaces for vehicles, we can build things closer together. And so it starts a reverse feedback loop, which is the opposite of the sprawl loop.
Well, that just brings me to Nichol then, in the sense that obviously transit is definitely a solution, right, to meet the climate crisis. And if we build more transit, right, we can meet our greenhouse goals. But it's also this moment of we still have this micromobility, and there's some transit agencies that are embracing it full hand, and there's some that are still asking questions. We'd love to hear how you guys are addressing and trying to bring it into your system.
So I would say Salt Lake City, and especially UTA, we are embracing it wholly. Part of my portfolio is innovative mobility solutions. We have an on-demand sector. We also are looking at AV as well. So Waymo, we're looking at something like that for some of our areas, as well as working with our TNCs to help us pick up trips where we miss them. So we look at it as a transportation portfolio, and we were always looking for solutions. UTA is a broad service area from very rural to our capital city. And so we have to look at solutions that meet all those needs, and they're very different. So I welcome you all to come try it out, but we have done a great job, I believe, and we'll continue to look at these micromobility options for our people and actually what new technologies can help in the transit world.
Let me stick with you for a second, because one of the things that fascinates me in an era of a moment of disruption, whether it's the pandemic or economic disruption, is that our workforce is so critical, right? To not only the transition of bringing our downtowns back, but also our own agencies, our own teams, whether you're in the development space. So I would love to hear about how you guys are approaching your workforce, because we all saw it. Like, we have to not only protect them, but also we need more workforce to deliver some of the capital goals that a lot of our agencies are trying to produce.
Yeah, this is what weighs on us at UTA every day and all those transit agencies out there. It's labor. And we are really taking a step back at how we organize our work, right? The working conditions, the flexibility, what people are looking for, which goes back to kind of that sustainable life to put out there. And so we actually have a system set up right now talking about getting the service on the road, and it starts from our planning team to our people team to our operations, and how we're going to move the service that we know is needed. We know we have ridership out there. We can't really pull it in until we get that labor taken care of. So it's really kind of an overhaul at UTA right now of how we are going to approach labor, hiring, and sustaining the service, and hopefully increasing it as we need to.
All right, so we're going to pivot a little bit in this conversation. I promised them that I would give them enough softballs to hopefully get, wheels spinning. But I also want to get you some questions I haven't tested them on yet, and so be prepared. This is what I would like to call the things that we don't say out loud. All right? The things we don't say out loud, but we should. So I'm going to give you a minute. Emeke, you first.
No, this one, I'm actually happy to call this spade a spade. So the neighborhood that I oversee is really exciting. If you've been to DC, you know that the energy is there. It's shiny. It's literally a new neighborhood, 15 years old. The critique that I have of my neighborhood is that we have not preserved the soul of that neighborhood. Again, so let me take us back. DC is a very diverse community. That neighborhood does not fully represent the diversity of that neighborhood. And so what can we do as we grow, and we want it to continue to grow? How do we ensure that that DNA, that authenticity, that part of DC not represented shows there? And it's through mobility investments, it's through culture, it's through lifting up history and things that happened or ceased to happen in the past. I'm talking about urban renewal. We are an urban renewal neighborhood, so part of our history is we basically made some neighborhoods disappear. And the vestiges of that are still something I think we struggle with. And so, yeah, that's the quiet part.
I'm going to let that sit for a second. That is one of the major issues that we are trying to address at the federal level. And the reality is there are thousands of Chapple riverfronts across the country that are struggling with this. Big towns, small towns. And one of the things that we are constantly emphasizing is centering community in that conversation, inviting those who have not been a part of the table, not just to hear them, but actually bring them into the solution. So I'm appreciative of you saying that part out loud. So Nichol, you're next up. What's the thing that should be said?
Well, I think I'm the wrong one for this question, but I think what's important, especially in a transit agency, and one of the things we are trying to balance is this idea of bus being sexy, right? You know, we're at a conference that changed its name, but for the last few years, it was rail, 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 rail. And now we're seeing as rail is necessary and we need it, but we also need to continue to invest in bus and invest in the people that need bus and and support that connection as a whole. None of the modes are bad. The modes are all needed for the community and how we serve them. What we need to do is make sure that we're looking at that balancing act.
Thank you. D.
That's a really hard question. I'm glad I at least got two to go first. The thing I'm thinking about is the livability of our downtown. As that increases, as we double that, our downtown is not livable enough yet. And what I mean by that specifically is green space. We've got the entertainment components, but we are at a deficit for green space. And all of the transit is important on some level, but if the real estate itself, if the area of downtown doesn't breathe in some way, we need to make some progress there. And some of our city partners are evaluating the permanent closure of Main Street. I think I said that a minute ago. We also have some quasi-public spaces that could be brought into the city park inventory that would make such a difference for those 5,000 residents that are already on their way to downtown.
Thank you for that, Ryan.
So I think buses are sexy. At Culdesac, we name our conference rooms after the most influential urbanists. So the biggest and best conference room is Jane Jacobs. We also have the Donald Shoup conference room, but we also have the Jaime Lerner conference room, and bus rapid transit can make a big difference. And I think that actually ride sharing and AV ride hail with the right policies in place can be this sort of second coming of bus rapid transit.
Now I'm going to go back to you. What's the thing that's not said that should be said?
When people are talking about housing affordability, they should be talking about housing and transportation affordability together.
You must have read my recent FAQs at the department. Karen, close it.
Yeah, I have a two-part one. So first of all, so high-income folks are willing to pay a premium for transportation choice. And that means that when we think about TOD and when we think about downtown, which has the best transportation choice of anywhere in the region, we are at risk of losing our diversity and not being inclusive. And so we need to find a way to leverage the willingness of high-income folks to pay that premium. And relatedly, this is the part that people don't say out loud. So there's all kinds of accessibility. And if you want to have inclusion, you may not need to put low-income folks right next to the transit station or even within a quarter mile or a half mile. You can have great accessibility within a mile, and you can get a lot lower land prices, and you can get a lot more affordable units if you are willing to go a little bit more out. So that's what I would advise.
Okay. Does the panel agree?
I agree.
Yeah.
Okay. Everyone's in agreement. That was easy. Thank you for sharing your perspective of the thing. So I think in many cases, what has always been great about Mpact, formerly known as Revolution, is that we can have the hard conversation. And I really appreciate you guys pushing that envelope a little bit. But Ryan, you said something that obviously resonated with me. When I was a young pup coming to these conferences, listening to Scott Bernstein and talk about how H&T, housing and transportation costs, and everyone had to go and look up their zip code and put their address in, and you kind of like, oh crap, my home in Thomasville, Georgia, our H&T was definitely over 60%. But now in my little walkable neighborhood in Union Market in Washington, D.C. is roughly 44%. And so you find that in a place like McAllen, Texas, they have one of the highest H&T in the country, close to 82%. Think about that. And when you go to McAllen and you talk to the workers and you listen how long they have to commute to come into downtown McAllen, and you hear that story not only in McAllen, you can hear that in Houston, you can hear that in Tampa. When you talk to military families who are literally traveling 2 hours one way to get to downtown Tampa because housing affordability is a huge challenge. That is something that this administration has made front and center in a lot of our policies. So if you looked at all of our discretionary grants, we are asking not just transportation options, because we all know transit, but we also want to know how is it related and connected to your housing policy. And increasingly, we're finding applicants are embracing and producing projects that bring those two things together. But one of the things I think we still struggle with is how do we address this housing affordability now but also over the next 10 to 15 to 20 years, because we also are seeing that the homes that we have built, particularly in our more suburban markets, are actually in climate vulnerable places. So as we're trying to address the housing affordability for people who have housing in downtowns or in our livable areas or transit-supported communities, we also have to think about, and I really appreciate you, Karen, calling out my colleague, Dr. Tracy Lowe. So when I was at Brookings, we did this report together where we identified close to 40 million Americans are living in homes that will not exist in the next 10 to 15 years due to flooding, fires, and climate disasters. Where do they go? So that's my question to Ryan, as the real estate developer. I feel like for you, this is a market news of like, okay, I got to keep building. But what do you see as the barrier for you producing more affordable car century? Because that is the desire of the market, but we're not producing it fast enough.
There's demand for walkable neighborhoods all over the country. And so if you think about where it works for us, you build new housing when there's job growth, you go to places that are welcoming of growth, and obviously the profitability matters. So being able to get the right parcels, and when those things are in place, we can build more walkable neighborhoods. And I think that one thing that policymakers can do is you can lower housing costs and increase profitability simply by having less bureaucracy, right? I used to work for the New York MTA and was sort of part of it, so I know how hard it is to change it within. But we're talking, we can get 10% plus housing cost decreases just through streamlining bureaucracy.
Nichol, I'm going to come to you next because a lot of transit agencies are here and the planners will say, transit agencies, we don't do housing. But so many of you now are looking at your existing assets, your land holdings, your parking lots, and asking yourselves, we have to be in this conversation. And for folks who haven't noticed, a week ago, the Department of Transportation announced a change in how we do disposition of land. And for transit agencies who have land, you can now, without ever coming to ask us, you can now transfer it to local governments or nonprofits for affordable housing. So I'm curious, how is the transit agency trying to lean in on housing affordability in Salt Lake City?
Well, this is something we've been doing for a few years at UTA. We've had a TOD now called Transit Orient Communities Department now looking at our surplus land and working with developers along there to gain ridership as well as build affordable housing. Salt Lake City specifically has very limited affordable housing, and what we're seeing is it's more sprawled and pushed out across the city. So this is something we continue to do. We do look at affordability, and I'm hoping that we continue to look at how far down we can go that affordability piece, and looking at nonprofits. We don't have a lot of nonprofit developers in Utah, but it would be great to expand that now that the administration allows for that.
So with that, Emeke, we had a conversation earlier, and you said something that I thought was quite profound. Between you and D, you guys are place managers, right? Your job is to bring the quality of life to life. But you have a board, you have a strategic plan, and one of the challenges that you're seeing even in Capitol Riverfront right now is a housing affordability. But you said something to me, which was something I think we all struggle with, which is that I do not want Capitol Riverfront to become a bedroom community. Talk about that tension.
Yeah, so I think I mentioned before, again, 58% of our land use is residential, which is great. It explains the reason why we're resilient from a financial standpoint, but there's more to it. The energy that makes that place a place is the people that visit it, whether it's for work, for entertainment, for recreation. Those people coming in and pumping out of the neighborhood is what makes it a place and not just a place where people go to lay their heads down. And actually, I want to weave back to your policy recommendation. As we were kind of talking about public space downtown, I'm going to use Robert Moses as an example, which I know is dangerous, but I'm still going to do it. So one of the things that Robert Moses did, and he used it for nefarious purposes, was he used park construction to build his roads, right? To build his freeways. He basically said, I'm going to use a park to divide a neighborhood, then I'm going to build the road that I want. One of the benefits of that is that the Federal Highway Administration, you're allowed to use some of the funds, and this is back to my DDOT days, to build public parks, and we've done that in the city. The Federal Transit Administration does not allow for that. Right. And that, I think, is an opportunity missed, is if you could allow some of those resources for a transit project to be used for public parks, a tremendous way to make place. 3% of the land area in the Capitol Riverfront bid are public parks. We manage 10 acres of public parks, splash parks, we do movies, we do all kinds of events there, and that's what makes part of that connective tissue work. And so there's your policy idea.
Thank you. That was a really good one. Okay, so we have a few more minutes left, and so I'm going to try to ask a couple of questions, and then I'll give you your immediate softball question at the end. So, Chapple, let me ask you this. From your research, what do you see coming over the horizon that we're not paying attention to?
Well, actually, from a personal perspective, we're losing our phone data. And actually, this affects transportation agencies too. A lot of us have been relying on phone data, and Apple changed its opt-in procedure.
Oh.
And that data is going to disappear for a lot of us. That's going to affect a lot of transportation agencies. But I'm very worried about the commercial office sector and the potential collapse of it, and then that impact on regional banks and kind of the domino effect on downtowns. I'm not a believer in the urban doom loop. Maybe one or two cities have that. But I do think we need to think a lot about those vacancies and that 15, 25, 30% vacancy in San Francisco. That's huge. I mean, I guess we knew that was coming, but I think we're not worrying about it enough.
Okay. Emeke, what do you see either for Chapple Riverfront, but again, you bring over 20 plus years of experience in this. What do you see around the horizon that we should be paying attention to?
Well, there's no way I couldn't bring up the commercial real estate issue. I do think that that's a big unknown, and I think that the good news is that there's models. I mean, DC is a perfect example of a city that was on its back and pivoted and took it and leveraged all of its assets to kind of create an amazing city, in my view. But I think that it should be a higher priority. It's one of those things we don't talk a lot about. And I think our biggest issue in DC in particular is that our transit system is teetering on the brink of insolvency, and we don't talk about it in mixed company. It's like things that people whisper in back rooms, and then we don't even talk about it. We even have the regional CFOs not even really putting it forward. So it's always solved itself, and I think we just think that things will happen as they happened in the past. So those are the two things.
I'm so glad you said that. Was actually my follow-up question. I was like, the thing I haven't heard from anyone is the viability of transit and the funding gaps that we're seeing. So, Nichol, I assume that might be one, but there may be others. Would you want to piggyback on that?
Yeah, I'll piggyback. Salt Lake City and UTA and our system is a little different because we're not funded by fare box recovery as a dominant source. Like the major areas were funded by sales tax. And so as the economy is really well, funding in that sense isn't a big problem for UTA, but labor is. But looking forward, how do we fund huge expansions of rail in our system is something that we do worry about. As we talked about, public transit is no longer 8 to 5, and that's how these systems have been built. And how do we move forward and help with these spikes in entertainment and spikes in huge mega events we're talking about? And the money and the infrastructure to support that is going to be difficult over the few years, and that's something we really got to watch out for.
And I would say that is one of those moments where, say, there are transit agencies, your mobility service providers, right? If you start thinking of that framework, it changes the whole dichotomy. So thank you for bringing that. Dee, looking through your crystal ball, looking through the horizon, what do you see?
In the short term, it's the crisis in office and the things that derive from that, the impact on commercial and retail, which affects vitality downtown as well. On the long front, and maybe this isn't on point for this transportation conference, but I want to see greater regional accountability for the homelessness issues in our community. Downtown bears the brunt of that. Homelessness increased 10% in Utah last year. But I guarantee you, most zip codes did not feel the impact of that like the 2 zip codes that are in downtown Salt Lake City, where the services are. And the community continues to look to the city mayor to solve this, which feels completely displaced. We are going to solve this on a regional level with regional resources and with housing solutions beyond what we're getting to in any meaningful way on a city level.
Right.
Well, we're not building enough walkable housing, and the playing field isn't level. We're giving enormous subsidies to all things car dependency, right? There's free use of the roads, but public transit agencies are struggling for funding. And I think that electric vehicles are going to potentially make this worse, partly because of the gas tax question. But also electric vehicles are much heavier, and that's going to actually increase the particulates in the air from tires, which is a huge problem for health. And meanwhile, we're subsidizing them $7,500, and there's no e-bike subsidy when people love e-bikes and we can get many people living car-free.
So here's your softball. What's your favorite form of transportation? Karen, we'll start with you.
I walk everywhere. Love it. Love it.
Scooters, because they're fun.
Scooters?
Airplanes. No. I'm sticking with airplanes.
My bike. I love my bike. I have for decades.
Same. It's my electric XP e-bike that I got for free when I signed my lease at Culdesac Tempe.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, give a round of applause to this amazing panel, this amazing conversation. Thank you. Thank you, Mpact, for a wonderful, wonderful session. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Mr. Marr.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of the Overhead Wire and published first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters for supporting this week's podcast, and you can find out more at patreon.com/theoverheadwire. And sign up for our 17-year-old newsletter by visiting theoverheadwire.com. To get the show each week, follow along at your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, YouTube, TuneIn, Apple Podcasts, and many, many more. And if you can't find it there, you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.